Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I'm here for my MSI Play-Ins Day number 4 overview and analysis video. We are here to determine the two teams that will be eliminated from MSI first at this tournament. Definitely not a fun day for a couple of these teams, but two teams are going to be staying alive. They are going to push their way into the lower bracket finals of their groups, and the winners of today will be one series away from qualifying for the main stage. But like we said, two teams also being eliminated, one from each group here today. So a lot on the line. I hope you guys are excited. If you are, let me know down in the comments section below. If you want to know my thoughts on what's happened at MSI up until this point, or what I expected to happen going in to this tournament, you can check out the playlist in the iCard. That's going to have my primer video. That's going to have all 3 days of analysis before this in terms of what's happened at MSI. So if you want kind of a breakdown of what has happened or what I think will happen moving forward, that is a great place to start. But today, we are going to be taking control and looking at the two lower bracket series, if you will, the two teams or the 4 teams that lost in round number 1 to get here. So I don't want to waste too much of you guys' time. Let's jump right into the analysis. If you are new here, what we do on this channel is go game by game, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game, and at the end of each series, I will be giving a player of the series to kind of tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. We will be talking about kind of the lower bracket finals, the qualification series that are going to be happening later on a couple days from now. I'm excited to cover those because I certainly think that, especially after today, there are a lot of storylines, a lot of things to talk about in terms of what to expect from those games, but most of today will be spent talking about the two series that happened yesterday. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. As has become a bit customary at this point, we're going to start with Group A and then head into Group B. And our Group A lower matchup, the two teams that lost in round number 1 out of Group A, of course, it's a matchup between the number 1 seed from the PCS in PSG Talon and the number 1 seed from the LLA and Estral Esports. So very excited to see where these two teams go. I think on paper, this certainly feels like more of a mismatch, in my opinion. This certainly feels like more of an advantage for one team over the other. I had PSG in a tier above all of the other minor region teams. I know people are really excited about Estral because of how they played against T1 in round number 1, but I think especially going back and looking at some of the plays that were made in that series, a lot of that doesn't seem to be something that I would expect to be entirely replicable. I've talked about it a bit when we talked about T1 yesterday in their preview, but I honestly think the narrative was a little bit out of whack in terms of how that series ended up going. Yes, there were moments where Estral were able to get more advantages than maybe you would expect the Latin American team to get against T1, the greatest organization in the history of League of Legends, but a lot of it came from T1 just overextending rather than Estral really kind of pushing their own tempo and creating their own advantages. I've seen a lot of comments on my videos and on Reddit and on social media talking about like, wow, you really underrated Estral putting them last. You especially underrated Zothve in the top lane because he solo killed Zeus and he was really good, quote unquote, that series. I mean, if that's what you want to believe, that's great. He did solo kill Zeus. That was definitely the highlight of the series for him, but I think a lot of the context is missing from that matchup, and part of me wonders if people even watched the game, if that's their takeaway from it. He solo killed Zeus because Zeus dove him under tower and just didn't have the damage to be able to kill him through that, but look at the rest of that game. Zothve's down 4 levels. He's Flame Horizoned. Like, I'm sorry, he was not on the same level as Zeus. Zeus massacred him in that series. It was not even remotely close, other than the solo kill, which was really the only positive play. Outside of that, there were, again, positives. I think Jose Deodo had a great series, especially when he was allowed to play a bit more aggressive in the early game on something like the Lee Sin. I think Ackerman is a player that I like a lot and that I think is a big positive for this team as a whole, but PSG is favored in this series for me. I don't even know if that's a controversial opinion. I don't know if that's become non-standard after how round 1 went. I think a lot of people looked at how Estral played and said like, oh, actually, they're going to beat, PSG because they did better against T1 than FlyQuest did or whatever. It's not what I would expect to happen here. PSG is a very complete team across the board. Junji and Maple are still very good, even if Maple really struggled in round number 1 against Fly. Betty and Woody were actually pretty okay in that series, and Aji, even though I'm not a huge fan of him, I think he should be favored in the top lane matchup. So I do think there are advantages for PSG, and I would still expect them to win this, as I said in my previous video, but to see if that ends up coming true, we have to go game by game, and that means starting with game number 1. And the winner of game number 1 was PSG. They are going to take the first game of this series. They're going to go up 1-0, and this is kind of what we expected to see. I don't mean to say this as a negative towards Latin America. This has absolutely nothing to do with the LLA in particular, but this game in particular felt like a major region versus a minor region team. It very much felt like, oh, you know, Estral is gaining advantages somewhere on the map. You know, they're diving Aji 4v1 at level 3 and taking 600 years to kill him, but, you know, Jose Deodo's in the right spots on the map. You're picking up kills with Nico Ultimate and things like that. You know, good picks, but then you look at the gold lead and it's always in favor of PSG. It's 2-3K in favor of PSG, even with Estral making all of these, you know, big plays, these big splash plays. It's very similar to what we saw when we watched Fnatic take on Top Esports yesterday. It very much feels like, yes, you are getting some of these plays off, but how much is it really impacting the actual game overall because you're losing on the margins? And that's something that PSG does incredibly well, and that's why I thought they were going to be better than a lot of the other teams at this tournament, is because they are one of the few minor region teams that is very macro-oriented and can play, you know, that margin style at a really high level, and that's kind of what we saw here. Player of the game for me, maybe controversially, is going to go to Aji in the top lane. I know he didn't have the same kind of, you know, KDA or scoreline that a lot of these other players had, but watching this game, the thing that stood out the most was the top gap, and that was something you were concerned about for Estral, just because I don't have a super high grade on Zotve. I don't think he's really that strong of a player internationally. Like, at an international perspective, I don't think he's that strong of a top laner, and Aji is somebody who I think you can, you know, funnel into. He's not a superstar, but he's good enough for you to be able to play with him, and he was awesome on the Udyr here. Completely unkillable by the time he got that solo kill later on in the game. I think it was around 10 or 15 minutes he solo kills Zotve, and then from that point onwards, he's just a menace in team fights, flanking the enemy team in the mid lane, constantly pushing, you know, a Snacker and Ackerman out of any sort of aggressive positioning that they want to go for. Cody had a really tough time trying to get through the Udyr. It just wasn't a particularly easy champion to break through on. So even if you're looking at the KDA and you're seeing, wow, he only participated in 3 kills and Junjia participated in 13, like, how can you not give this to Junjia? How is it going to Aji? I think when you watch the tape, it was clear which player stood out the most, at least in my opinion. But again, it wasn't just Aji. Junjia had an excellent game on the Wukong, established pressure very early on. This is how you need to be able to beat something like Maokai. One of my biggest pet peeves with Maokai, with Sejuani, with a lot of these more facilitative junglers, is pairing them up with something in the mid lane that really has no prio in the early game. I think Maokai Aurelion Sol is just such a passive lane. It's really not something that can work, and you're relying a lot on your side lanes to actually be able to develop a lot of that aggression in the early game. That's why you went for the lane swap, and that's why lane swaps are becoming more popular, is to try to get those bot lanes a little bit more, you know, experience, and try to get those bot lanes moving forward a little bit earlier on in the game. But if you don't have any pressure in the middle of the map, especially going into something like Wukong Talia, it's just going to be a lot more difficult for you to be able to skirmish over any objective in the early to mid game, and you're going to fall behind on the margins, which is what we talked about. Junjia did a great job of punishing that. I think Betty was really great this game. Really good positioning from him. I think he's going to go underrated for how strong he was here. Woody was good. Maple was definitely better than he was on day number 1. I think everything was just kind of clicking for PSG Talon. They made a couple of mistakes, or more accurately, I would say Estral definitely kept their foot on the gas at times in this game, and they had to give over some things, but they never really felt like they were out of control, and I think that's what you wanted to see from them. And then for Estral Esports on the other side, again, it just doesn't feel like they are on quite the same level as a team like PSG at this tournament. They are able to keep up in terms of some of the aggressive plays that they're going to make. You know, you can get a 3v1 or a 4v1 dive off, and you're able to generate resources for members of your team, and it's going to look okay in that regard, but then you really are going to lose in a lot of other areas. Not only is your macro weaker, which was very clear in this game, PSG has great macro, and Estral just was not able to keep up on that front, but even the individual, like, laning differences, the 1v1s, you're seeing CS leads all across the board for PSG, and I think that's unfortunately just the reality of the matchup here. Zotfe is going to get my dud of the game in the top lane on this Renekton. He did not play well at all, and I continue to think that he's been a bit of a problem for this team. I gave him dud of the game in both of the T1 games. He got Flame Horizoned in game 2. He was really destroyed in game number 1. I get it that he's had a couple of splash plays, and, you know, he survived a gank on the top side here for a lot longer than people would have anticipated on that Renekton, and there were a couple of plays that I do think he played well, but at the end of the day, he's clearly being targeted by the enemy teams that he's going up against, and he is kind of an open hole for other teams to get experience right now. I'm not not going to sit here and say that he's a horrible player. It's just not worked so far at this tournament for me. I think there are also some negatives. I don't think anyone really outside of Jackie Love has played Kalista all that well at this tournament. I still think Kalista is very strong, and I think her win rate and her success rate is going to go dramatically up once we get into the main stage, when we start getting the best teams in the world actually playing and playing Kalista. I think it really is one of those champions where you can see the difference between like a really good team and a really bad team, or not a really bad team, a really good team and just kind of an okay team playing Kalista. I think that's something we're going to continue to see. I continue to like Ackerman. I think he plays really aggressive, and I like the angles that he looks for with some of these engages on Nico. It just isn't enough. Cody couldn't really do anything on the A Soul. He never got the opportunity to scale because his team was behind. And Jose Deodo needs to be on something more aggressive. I love Maokai, but not for this team. You need to give Jose some proactivity. That's always been when they've been at their best. And so for Estral, you are now on elimination point. This is best of 3. So if you lose this game, you're out of MSI. It would be sad to see them go as the first team, but it wouldn't be entirely surprising. Can PSG shut the door on this series with a 2-0 series win, or is Estral going to push us to a game number 3? Well, the winner of game number 2 was PSG. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to take the series in a 2-0 sweep. And unfortunately, that's going to be the end of the tournament for Estral Esports. They put up a good fight. They had to face T1. They had to face PSG. You know, probably the toughest team in play-ins, or at least arguably the toughest team in play-ins in T1, especially against minor region teams. They do a great job of strangling control of that. And then the best minor region team at this tournament out of the best minor region in the PCS. So definitely a rough draw, I would say, for Estral, all things considered. But this game was not particularly close. This wasn't a back-and-forth affair where they put up a pretty decent fight. They kind of got slaughtered in this series as a whole, but especially in this game number 2, just not a particularly close one. It's really good to see that from PSG, though, because we were going into this tournament with the expectation that they at least had an opportunity to get out of play-ins, to get into the main stage, to be better than a team like FlyQuest. I had them back-to-back in terms of my power rankings. I certainly don't think it's impossible for a team like PSG to win a series against Fly, a best of 3, no less, against FlyQuest, and this was just another example that is definitely still on the table. You are not out, you are not, like, done because you have to face a team like Fly who beat you in round number 1. So let's go ahead and talk about game 2. Player of the game and player of the series for me is going to go to Junjia in the jungle. Massive Junjia fan. That's not a secret on this channel. I have stated that very heavily since 2022, since he was on Edward Gaming, since he was a player who came in and, quite frankly, completely rehabilitated their entire season. I think people forget just how good he was in the LPL. He goes over to the PCS, and he continues to be an MVP caliber player over there. He was by far the best player in the entire region this year in the spring split, and he's shown up here internationally. He was really, really good in this series. The Wukong is just a very difficult pick to end up dealing with if he gets ahead, because he has so many different tools to be able to not only set up the rest of his teammates, but also carry the game in terms of the damage output he's able to do. He can side lane, he can team fight, he can do a little bit of everything. His objective control is very consistent. And Junjia is a super smart macro player. That's always been his biggest advantage as a player. What I said in my primer video is that he's kind of like budget Peanut. Like, I really do believe that. He's like Peanut, but worse. And I think that that's the kind of version of Junjia that you got in this game. A player who is just going to keep his foot on the gas, who's going to get his laners ahead, but can also do a lot on his own as well. So he was player of the series as a whole, probably the most impactful player, but Aji is definitely someone that I think deserves to be in that conversation. An amazing game 1 from him on the Udyr, where he was just unkillable throughout a majority of that game, constantly punishing bad positioning mistakes that Estral was making. And then here in game 2, it's not like the Twisted Fate was any less impactful. I think the Wukong was just a little bit more impactful. Aji was fantastic, and, you know, we talked about top lane potentially being a problem for Estral. That unfortunately ended up playing out. You know, Aji's not a player that I think is a superstar by any means, but he was certainly good enough to be able to dominate a series like this. I think Betty and Woody were good. Woody in particular had a very good game on the R5 Renata. Varus is just so consistent that Betty kind of got to do whatever he wanted in a lot of these team fights, and Maple was flash landing these charms on repeat. This was definitely a much better performance than what we saw out of him against FlyQuest, where he was a bit of a detriment to this team overall. So PSG just looking good. Really not a lot of negatives for me to give them. I think they did what they were supposed to do in this series. They should be walking out of a series like this with a 2-0 win. They are more talented, they have better macro, and they went out and proved that here today. For Estral, you know, it's definitely going to feel a little bit frustrating that you couldn't take a game at this tournament. I think they came into this series maybe with overhyped expectations. We saw some analysts being like, well, Estral is better. Look at how close they played T1. We saw people like Doan B saying, you know, we put together scrim results for Estral and they would be like a playoff team in the LPL. You know, there were a lot of conversations floating around about this team, but on tape, it just never has really shown up for me. And I think this is more of what I expected expected from this team here in game number 2. Dead of the game is going to go to Cody. You know, we talked a lot about Emo yesterday for GAM, or not yesterday, 2 days ago, for GAM not doing so well and being a bit of a negative for his team overall. Well, Cody was amazing domestically. He was somebody who did have expectations coming into this tournament and quite frankly just wasn't good enough. He was not very good in game 2 against T1 either, was taken advantage of on the Ari in that game, and he was awful on the Taliyah here, constantly engaging only to instantly die in a lot of these instances, just pulling the trigger in situations that he really shouldn't have been. That's kind of the problem with Taliyah. You do have a go button, and sometimes if you're not using the go button properly, it can put you in a lot of bad positions. It can put your team in a lot of bad positions, but he had to burn his flash super early on in lane, and, you know, then Junji all of a sudden just starts punishing him over and over again. It just became an unwinnable matchup for him, and things did not get better as the game continued to go along. I think Cody's still a good player. I'd love to see him grow domestically, but this was an unfortunate international debut for him, I would say. I think the same thing could be said about the top side of the map. Zotfe, you know, I've talked about him a lot. He just wasn't very good in this series. In my opinion, wasn't very good at this tournament. Aji definitely outplayed him in both of these games, really abused him in lane. And I can't say I'm really shocked. This is how I expected the matchup to go, so credit to Aji, but Zotfe was not good at this tournament. Jose Deodo probably had his weakest game of the tournament here in game 2. It is what it is. He was pretty good throughout a lot of this tournament, just lost a lot of pressure early. His laners got destroyed in most instances, and so a lot of the plays that he wanted to go for, the skirmishes that make Xin Zhao a very difficult champion to play into, they just weren't available because the Wukong was already in such a dominant position. I do think Snacker and Ackerman were definitely the two best players on the team here in game 2. Ackerman was the best player on this team in this tournament. I think a lot of the attention is going to go to Jose, but I think Ackerman was honestly very good as an engaged threat, and I think Snacker did a good job in lane. These two were strong in the 2v2. It just didn't really matter. The rest of the team spiraled out of control. But I do think there are positives to take away. Jungle and bot were definitely positives for Estral, all things considered. At this tournament, they weren't disasters, even if the solo laners didn't necessarily live up to the hype. You know, Estral can go back to the LLA, continue to grow, and if we see them at Worlds later on this year, I wouldn't be shocked if they're a better team. But for PSG, they now move on to take on FlyQuest in that rematch to see who can get out of the play-in stage. That's going to be a really fun one. And really, there's not a lot of reason to believe that it's impossible for PSG to win that. I don't think they're going to be favorites going into that series. I think FlyQuest should be favorites because they beat them and because they are a major region team and they are pretty clean in certain areas, but if PSG ends up winning it, I don't think me or a lot of other analysts at this point are going to be all that shocked. But now that we've seen the Group A side of the day, it's time to move into Group B. And I think this series is definitely going to be closer. At least I would predict it to be closer with my pre-tournament analysis. It's the #1 seed from the VCS in GAM Esports taking on the #1 seed from the CB LOL in Loud. I think both of these teams have their strengths and their weaknesses. I think that has become clear for both of them already at this tournament. Of course, Loud probably being a bit more consistent across the board. This is essentially the same Loud team that we had last year with an exception in the support position. Losing Sayos, getting Redbert, I do think it's a bit of a downgrade in terms of their ability to play at the highest level. We saw that Sayos was kind of their star for a lot of last year, at least in terms of their late domestic playoff runs and how well he played internationally, but there are still plenty of talent on this team to be able to perform at a high level, and GAM looks completely lost. I think a lot of people already had lower expectations for them going into a tournament like this because you're playing with two substitutes, Emo and Easy Love, in your carry roles, mid and AD carry, essentially plucked out of non-competitive in order to fill these roles after the match-fixing scandal in the VCS. Well, Emo, I think, was in Academy, and Easy Love was retired, I believe. So, you know, it's not like they had never played competitive before, but still a much different stage than I think that they were expecting where they were at. But you still have a lot of talent on this team, mostly on the top side. Kiaya and Levy, I think, are both excellent players that can carry games and win series for teams like GAM against teams like Loud if they're able to get ahead. Now, one thing to note, Kiaya was not very good in round #1. I understand the matchup wasn't ideal, but Oscar Rinnan should not have been so much better than Kiaya. It really was a bit of a shock to see things go so poorly in the top side for GAM in that first series. If Kiaya continues to not perform well, I don't think GAM has a chance in hell of being able to win a series like this, but you have to imagine that he's going to be able to bounce back at least a little bit because he has been so successful for such a long time. Levy as well, Levi in the jungle, is a very, very good player, and he's had a bounce back year in my opinion. Not that he was bad in the previous years, but this was his best tape I think he's shown in a while. So even if I don't trust Emo, even if Easy Love was horrendous in that first series, even if Elio is not somebody that I really believe in as a top tier support, like, GAM has the opportunity to win this. I just don't think they're going to be favorites. Loud are the clear favorites going into this because they are just a bit more cohesive across the board. You have more less problems, I'll say, even if you're upside. Like, I think Kiaya and Levi might be the best players in this series, but Emo, Easy Love, and Elio might be the 3 worst players in this series, and that's why I think Loud should be favored. I really like how Tinones plays against lesser mid laners. That's something that he has always done really well, as he's capitalized on his macro advantage in particular to be able to press issues. And then, you know, even if I don't think Root and Redbert have been excellent over the course of this year, I think they've certainly been more questionable. I don't think GAM has a particularly strong bot lane. I think they have the weakest bot lane at this tournament. So I think Loud should be favorites going into this, but hopefully GAM can figure something out. But we're going to have to figure that out across the games, and that means starting with game number 1. And the winner of game number 1 was Loud. They are going to take the first game of this series. They're going to go up 1-0. They were in pretty good control of this game early on. Things started to get a little bit shaky as we entered the mid game, as we got around 20 to 25 minutes. GAM actually did a really good job of continuing to keep their foot on the gas, continuing to apply pressure, not really just rolling over and dying. We'll talk about it, but Kiaya in particular had a very good game for GAM, and that's exactly what we wanted to see from them. But again, their mistakes were just a little bit too big to overcome, and Loud did a very good job of establishing that pressure early so that when they did get to these later game situations, even with a later game comp, they could go 50-50 in some of these fights and still be on the positive end because of the things that they had set up beforehand. So credit to them. Player of the game for me is going to go to Croc on the Lee Sin. You know, Lee's been a really popular and successful pick so far this tournament. We've seen even teams that lose on Lee have a really big impact with that champion because of just the amount of prio he establishes in the early game. It's something we were seeing towards the end of playoffs in a lot of the major regions, that Xin Zhao was becoming super popular, and then outside of that, it's a lot of scaling junglers. You know, Viego's been a popular pick at this tournament, but Maokai, Sejuani, like, they're going to be your common picks in the jungle, and so if you have something like Lee Sin that can be super active in the early game, that can potentially punish the slowness, I guess, of those champions, and maybe with the exception of Xin, who obviously is a little bit quicker, but Lee Sin can duel Xin pretty easily, then it's going to fit really well into the meta. And Croc is very good at Lee Sin. He's always been very good at Lee Sin every single time we've seen him internationally, so not shocked to see him have such a good early game here, but I think he was very valuable in some of the late game fights as well. I'm not just going to say that it was just him, but I truly do think he was the biggest impact on the game as a whole, which is a good sign for Loud. And then you've got Robo and Tinones, who I think also had really good games overall. Tinones was very integral to some of those late game fights. I think the damage on the Azir was really kind of undersold by a lot of people watching the game. I think when you go back and watch a lot of those late team fights, even the ones that they lost, Tinones is doing a great job of outputting a ton of damage. I mean, if he had more reliable frontline at times in the back half of these fights, or if they weren't taking fights at disadvantaged numbers, things like that, if they could have more front-to-back setups, I think Tinones could have just straight up won the game for this team with some of the fights that they had and some of the ways he was playing these fights. Unfortunately, that just wasn't the situation at hand, but Tinones, I think, had a very good game, all things considered. Robo was very good, got a solo kill on the Tristana in the mid lane, which is always a very funny circumstance, but he was very valuable in a lot of these fights as well, being unkillable for the most part because it's Trist, Talia, Xin Zhao, like, you just don't have the damage to break through Ornn in the late game, but those ultimates were always on point. His positioning was really good, especially in the back half, and again, his aggression is just really positive overall. He's a very good dueler, as we saw in the 1v1 against Kiaya, and I think that's going to continue to kind of push him over the top. Jax is going to be a bit of a permaban against him because of his domestic performances, but he has clearly shown that he can play a lot more than just that. If you have concerns, Root and Redbert, they weren't bad, they just were kind of irrelevant. Senna is just kind of there so far at this tournament. I like Senna, but I don't think bad teams are going to get the most out of a champion like Senna because you really need to be able to consistently get stacks. If you're sitting below the stack total, if you're fasting and you're down a ton of gold and you don't really have a lot of those inherent stats, you're just not going to be all that useful as a champion. I think Root played the final team fight in the base really well. I think that was his best team fight of the game by far, but outside of that, not a lot of great plays, and Redbert really didn't do anything this game, and bot lane continues to be a bit of a concern for me when it comes to Loud, but the top side of the map was very strong, and I think strong enough, more than strong enough to get them over the top in this game. And then for GAM, like I said, the positives are Kiaya, who I thought played a lot of these later team fights really, really well. Maybe his laning phase wasn't perfect. Losing out in a 1v1 or a 2v2 essentially against an Ornn is really not an ideal circumstance to have happen in the early game, but being able to respond from that and being very difficult to deal with as this game went further and further along is a big positive. I think especially around the fight around Baron before they lost it, I think Kiaya was doing a really good job of kind of frontlining, establishing pressure, basically getting Tinones entirely out of the fight. He did what he was supposed to do, and he was a bit of a menace, but the rest of the team just wasn't quite as useful. Emo had a couple of good ults, but he was doing no damage by the end of the game. Elio was just a little bit too over-aggressive, relying on the rest of his team to be able to follow up on engages that just weren't perfectly timed, and then You've got two players that I think had really poor games. Levi, I think, was not good on the Xin Zhao. Croc was clearly more active in the early game, and then you look at some of these late game team fights, the Xin Zhao's just not going to be able to do anything if he has to play from behind. That's just kind of the way the champion works. And then dead of the game is going to go to Easy Love on the Tristana. He was miserable in their first series. I know Emo is getting a lot of negative attention for that second game against Fnatic, where he played really horrible, but Easy Love to me was worse across both games. He just was never relevant in that series against Fnatic, and he shows up here in game number 1, and he continues to be a pretty big negative for this team. Not only is he not really doing as much as he should be in the early game trying to punish the scaling Senna pick, but he loses a 1v1 to Ornn in the mid lane. His positioning in these fights is useless. It just doesn't feel like Easy Love is good enough to play at this level right now. Through the first 3 games, it has not been a good look for him, so the bot lane simply has to be better. If Loud's bot lane is going to be their quote-unquote weakness, you have to be able to capitalize on that if you're GAM, and it just doesn't feel like they have the talent pool to be able to do that. Their weaknesses, again, are being exploited, but again, it's only game 1. If they can win game 2, you send yourself to a game 3, then it's winner take all. Anybody can win a game number 3, so you have to be on your A game here, or else you are out of the tournament. But for Loud, they would love to cap off this day with a 2-0 win to get themselves in a position to be 1 series away from getting into the main stage of Worlds, of MSI. We're not at Worlds yet. What am I talking about? At MSI. So really excited to see what happens here in game number 2, but let's go ahead and see it. The winner of game number 2 was GAM Esports. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to tie up the series at 1 apiece, and we've got ourselves a game 3 on our hands. It feels like game 3 has been a little bit more difficult to come by as of late, but we get one in this series, and this was a crazy game. There was absolutely no reason for us to be going to game 3 in this one. There is no reason for Loud to have lost this game. They overextended in a pivotal moment, and they threw away their gigantic lead that they were able to generate, and, credit to GAM for being able to spot their way to get back into this game. I think a couple of their players individually played really well, but they really should not have won this game. This was gifted to them by Loud. They really had no excuse to be back into this so long as Loud didn't just play way too fast, and that's exactly what they did. They played way too fast. So we'll go ahead and talk about it. GAM did win, and I'm not trying to take away this win from them. I'm not trying to say they didn't deserve it. They played great. Like, their team fighting was excellent in this game, and a worse team would have taken the opportunity that Loud gave them and just not done anything with it because they weren't good enough to win the fights. They weren't good enough to play from neutral from that point onwards in the game. But GAM did a phenomenal job of being able to push the small advantages that they did have and capitalize on some really great engages from a couple of their members. Player of the game to me is going to go to Kiaya. I think this is pretty open for debate. Everybody on the team, I think, did their job in this game, but Kiaya was the one that I think was standing out the most. Urgot has honestly been a really strong pick so far at this tournament. I'm interested to see if that's going to continue. We've really only seen Bwipo and Kiaya play it. Both are very good top laners, but Kiaya continuing to look strong in this series, and that, again, is a turning point for GAM. That is an important piece for what GAM does. He is by far the most important player on this team. When he is clicking, they always have a chance to win the game. When he's not clicking, they're probably not going to be able to beat anybody. That's how much of an influencing factor he is, and when he was this much better than Robo in this game, all of a sudden, GAM actually has an opportunity to be able to win it, so credit to Kiaya. He was unkillable by the end of this game. Urgot with Sterix is just, like, untouchable if you are playing him correctly, and there were a lot of mistakes made by Loud. Robo brought him over the wall in some pivotal fights right directly into the middle of the rest of the team, and I understand maybe wanting to try and burst down the Urgot before the rest of the team can capitalize alongside him, but that's not the avenue I personally would have taken. That's for damn sure. So, Kiaya definitely doing a lot of work in this game, but you gotta give credit to the carry duo as well. The two new players on this GAM team, Emo and Easy Love, both had easily their best games of the tournament up until this point. Emo was lights out with the charms. He was not whiffing them. The only times he was ever missing charms was when he was just slightly out of range. I can forgive him for that. He was very good in this game. He went deathless. And then Easy Love was phenomenal on the Zeri in the late game team fights. Maybe a little bit less useful early on in the game, but did have a pretty good laning phase, all things considered. Just really started to take off in those 5v5s. Once the game became neutral, once Loud kind of gave over their big lead in the bot lane, trying to end the game prematurely, then Easy Love was really unlocked, and he could play the game a lot more freely from there, and I think he did well. Levi and Elio were both very good in that same vein. Levi had a couple of phenomenal engages. That final one, right below mid lane, where he just flanks the entirety of Loud and gets like a 5-man knockup. It was so beautiful from the Wukong. Elio was okay. A couple of bad hooks this game, but a couple of really important ones, and so you can overlook some of the more negative ones. Overall, this is just a pretty good game from GAM. They could have played the early game a bit better, and obviously they really shouldn't be here winning the game, but they took an opportunity that Loud gave them, and they made the most of it, and that's all you can really ask of them. But for Loud, you're gonna feel pretty awful about losing this. GAM is a team that I think a lot of people have given up on, and for you to have the game in your hands here in game number 2, to have the end in your fingertips and to throw it away, it's just a bit disappointing. What essentially happened is they had the push down in bot lane, they take the inhibitor tower, they take the bot lane inhibitor, but instead of just backing off as GAM starts to recoup, as the Urgot starts to back, as, you know, things start to get a little bit less concrete, I would say for them overall, they continue to push to try to end the game, and they get aced. They get absolutely destroyed in that fight. They give over every advantage that they have, and all of a sudden GAM wins every fight from then on in the game. It's definitely disappointing, but it's certainly the CBLOL way to play the game, is to just try to end on the spot. Unfortunately, it just didn't work. Dead of the game could go to one of two members. I think it's all up to personal preference. I'm going to give it to Redbert. In the support position, this Tom Kench was not good this game. I mean, truly, those team fights were horrendous from Tom. I think he played the mid game very, very horribly. It was okay in the later half of the game, but there's not much that Tom can do in those particular instances, and quite frankly, watching Redbert, it does feel like he's a bit outclassed at this tournament. He has not been very good at MSI so far, which is definitely disappointing. Not that Root has been much better. Loud's bot lane has been a negative for this team all in all, I would say. So definitely not something you like to see there, but Robo also got completely destroyed on the top side. We talked about some of the team fight mishaps that happened with him ulting the Urgot over the wall with the all-out, only to put him right in the middle of the entire team, and Urgot's going to do 10,000 damage in that instance. Not only that, but it's not like he was actually dealing damage at any point in this game. He lost lane early on. Just not a particularly good game from Robo. It's just he played really bad. If you want to give dead of the game to Robo, give it to him. If you want to give it to Redbird, give it to him. I think they were by far the two worst players on Loud. Croc got a lot of resets and a lot of really good fights. He was very integral in these team fights to try to keep the game close, and when they were winning, he was the reason they were winning, but he also made a couple of pretty big macro mistakes in this game that I think definitely needed to be cleaned up. Tinones was pretty consistent. I don't really have a lot of negatives to give Tinones. He did what he was supposed to do. He just wasn't able to carry the game, and that just is what it is sometimes. But if Loud is now sitting here going into game 3, you cannot lose this, because you should have ended this series here. If you end up losing to GAM, a team that everybody has kind of pseudo given up on, after having game 2 in the palm of your hands, kind of throwing it away, that's going to be a disaster, not only for you, but for the fans of the CBLOL, who are very active, very, very, opinionated online. That's not going to be a great environment. So you got to win this game 3, but for GAM, you've been gifted this opportunity. You have to make the most of it. If you can win this series, I think that's going to be a pretty big accomplishment for the VCS, all things considered, with how things have happened over the course of this year. So what's going to happen in this pivotal game number 3? Well, the winner of game number 3 was GAM Esports. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to take the series 2-1, and they are going to be moving on to have their rematch with Fnatic in the lower bracket finals to see who the second team out of Group B will be. But Loud, unfortunately, is going to be one of the first teams eliminated from MSI this year. The CBLOL kind of underperforming expectations, I would say, a bit here. I think they expected to be able to win this series. They were definitely favorites to win this series, not only going into today, because I think GAM obviously looked horrible in round number 1 against Fnatic, but, I think even going into the tournament, most people would have told you that Loud should have been better than GAM, even if I did have them in the same tier, but this was not good. They had this series in the palm of their hand in game 2, and then they come out here for game 3, and it's the least close game of the entire series. Definitely a bit of a disappointing turn for them overall, but it is what it is. We have to congratulate GAM through all of the controversy, through all of the ups and the downs and the turmoil that this org and this region has faced over the course of 2024 so far. Here they are, winning an international best of 3, moving on, not being a bottom 2 team at MSI. Like, we can talk about how that's like, okay, well, they're probably going to get stomped by Fnatic, and, they might not do a ton after this, but for this region to not be dead last after everything that has gone on this year, like, that has to be a point of pride ride, I would say, for VCS fans. This has to feel like a very good moment for them overall. So we'll go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game for me is going to go to Easy Love in the AD carry role. He was awesome here in Game 3 on Zeri. He was constantly winning. He was the focal point for where GAM wanted to put all of their resources. There was a funny screenshot where he was at one point like 10 or 11k gold up on just Root, like just his own lane opponent, because Fasting Senna was taken to a bit of an extreme in this game, which we will definitely talk about as we go further along talking about Loud. But Easy Love was excellent. This is the best game I've personally seen him play. I'm sure he's been very good in the VCS in the past, but this was something new for me. You know, he's been somebody who has definitely struggled in the first couple of games at this tournament, was not good against Fnatic at all, and was definitely struggling a bit in game number 1. But games 2, 3, they definitely show why this team wanted to invest in him as a player. He was awesome on the Zeri. He absolutely carried this game. But player of the series as a whole for me is actually going to go to Kiaya in the top lane. Might be a bit of a controversial decision, but again, I think when Kiaya's winning, everybody's winning on GAM. It just kind of seems to be a little bit of a trend for this team when he is able to really express his big skill difference. And Robo wasn't bad in this game. I'll get to that in a second. This was his, best game, I would say, for a little while. Kiaya was definitely still better, and the Twisted Fate, even being a bit of an ego pick, I would say, in this one, having a full damage comp, really no actual peel or frontline or any sort of stability on this team, he was still excellent on this champion, and his ability to kite out in 1v1, it's just near the top of the world right now. He is very good at knowing his timers, knowing how to play off of his jungle, and really being able to push tempo of games. I think Kiaya is one of those players that should be in a major region. He really is that good in terms of how he plays the game, but everybody on GAM played well. This was, like I said, probably the cleanest game of the entire series from either of these teams, I should say. Levi was very good on the Lee Sin. A couple of these plays were really expertly played out. He was somebody that I was really looking at as a positive. I think Elio had his best game of the entire tournament here in game number 3. Really no negatives. I mean, when you go deathless on Nautilus, that's a pretty big positive, a pretty big plus in your direction. The only player that I can say I wasn't like super impressed with individually would be Emo in the mid lane, who I think was just whatever on the Akali. A couple of mechanical mishaps, I would say, a couple of weird plays that he had. It didn't really matter, though. He was still doing good things. I just would say a little bit less so than the other 4 members of this team, but GAM was really excellent here in game 3. This goes to show that this team has been gaining confidence over the course of this tournament. Maybe they can go into a series against Fnatic, a second series against them, and, play a little bit better this time. That has to be kind of the outlook for this team, but unfortunately for Loud, this is going to be the end of the run for them at MSI. This is going to be the end of the run for the CB LOL, and it's a very sad way to go out. They just didn't play all that great here in game number 3. Again, you're going to feel disappointed that you weren't able to take this series, especially after the way game 2 ended. I think people are going to stick on that for a while, but the flaws of this team were very clear, not only in this series, but I think throughout this entire tournament. This bot lane was the worst performing bot lane at this tournament. I know we can talk about how, Root is not a Senna player, and I get it. Like, Root is not a Senna player. I completely agree, even going back and watching some tape specifically for this segment of the video. I can understand why CB LOL fans are so upset that they went Senna 3 games in a row here, because it's just not the direction that this team has been wanting to play for a majority of this year. But I can only critique what actually happened in these games, and quite frankly, there was no bot lane who performed worse across this tournament than Root and Redbird, in my opinion. Root's gonna get dead of the game in game 3 here. This is a no-brainer. Like I said, he was down 10, 11k gold just individually against Easy Love in his lane matchup, which is certainly not an ideal situation to be in. Redbird, though, might have been one of the worst players at the entire tournament. This guy did absolutely nothing for the entirety of all of their games. I don't even think he was all that great in game number 1 here, which they were able to win. I think he was bad in game 2. I think he was obviously bad here in game number 3, where he wasn't involved in a single kill that the team had across the entire game. I mean, Redbird did not feel like somebody who could survive at this level, and especially because he is the replacement for what was, in my opinion, the best player on this team last year. The expectations were high, and I don't think it was met. I think the bot lane had to be better. I think Croc was a little bit whatever in this game number 3. He was really good in the first 2 games, and so I'm not going to criticize him too heavily, but he definitely had his worst game of the series here in the 3rd game. I do think Robo and Tinones tried their best. Robo a bit earlier on in the game, he got a bunch off of the really early like level 1 or level 2 fight that happened in the upper jungle. That was very strange, but Robo did a good job of trying to, keep that pressure on, and then Tinones was really more relevant in a lot of the late game team fights. I think maybe he had a bit of positioning mishaps in the mid game, but I think especially when you get to those front-to-back 5v5s, Tinones is very good in that environment, and I think he was probably the most consistent member of the team this entire series, but it, again, just wasn't enough. And for Loud, that's going to be the end of MSI. Hopefully they can retool and come back for Worlds or come back for another international at a better level. This team obviously had higher expectations than what they accomplished here, but I got to be honest, like, there was a reason I put them, in the F tier alongside GAM, alongside Estral. I didn't think they were all that different from them in terms of what I watched in the CB LOL. This didn't feel like the same kind of team that we had last year for Loud that could really make a difference in international competition. I didn't feel the same way watching them, and unfortunately that played out here at MSI. I certainly think they have the potential to get back there, but it's just frustrating to not see it be there at this tournament. And then for GAM, I don't know what the future holds. I don't know if this team is just going to get slammed by Fnatic again, but if that's going to be the case, I think they're still going to feel very good at the fact that they were able to win this series at all, at the fact that they were able to win a series internationally. Again, I can't stress enough, with all of the turmoil, all of the controversy and drama surrounding the VCS right now, they desperately needed this win, and they got it. So congratulations to this team. Congratulations to these players. They, I think, really stepped it up when they needed to. Alright, but that is going to do it for my MSI Play-Ins Day number 4 overview and analysis video. We've only got one more series left of the play-ins for each group. We've got Fly versus PSG on Group A, Fnatic versus GAM in Group B, rematches of Round 1 series here. I'm incredibly excited for it. Just so you guys know, as like a bit of a content update, I will be taking Sundays off for this tournament because there are no games on, I believe, the Mondays, technically, in terms of where I'm at in terms of the time zones in America, and so tomorrow there will be no video, but we will have, of course, these two series covered the day after on Monday for me here, so just a bit of a scheduling update there. I don't think you guys are going to be too upset by that, but if you want my predictions, I predict it to go the same way it did in round number 1. I think Fly and Fnatic will get over the hump. I think Fnatic in particular has a very easy job here. GAM should not be good enough to be able to go toe-to-toe with Fnatic. I think Fly and PSG theoretically could go either way. I think Fly definitely has a small advantage, but if PSG won it, I wouldn't really be all that shocked. I think PSG is a genuinely good team, and Fly's certainly not the kind of team that's immune to mistakes either, so we'll have to end up seeing, but let me know what you guys think down in the comment section below. Do you agree with me that the two major region teams are going to get out, or do you think either of the wildcard teams could have an opportunity here in the series? I would love to know your thoughts and opinions down below. Of course, if you enjoyed the video, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We are going to post about every single day of MSI, both play-ins and main stage on this channel. Of course, we're going to cover all 4 of the major regions when they get back into Season 4 this summer after this tournament's over, so hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when all of those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all